Um, Regular and substantive interaction. We're going to start. I'm going to do just a high-level definition of what these new federal guidelines are. I by no means am the expert in this. That's what our panelists are for. So at that point, I will turn it over to the panelists, and they can give a quick introduction of themselves and sort of where they're coming from. And then we're just going to have a conversation around like, what does this mean in practice? To start with, and just to get this out of the way, legal disclaimer: this is not legal advice. There is a lot of complexity in this. I like to compare it a little bit in my head to FERPA, to where it's like it makes sense at the base level, but interpreting it legally for your institution is not our job. So we're here to get some questions answered, and honestly, probably leave you with more questions to think about than you came in with, which maybe that's successful, but that's what we'd like to accomplish here. The panelists have shared a whole bunch of resources that we'll share out both in chat during this and also after the fact, and this will also be recorded so that we can share it out, but that recording will probably not go out till next week as we gather everything from the conference together. So let me give a quick overview here. So in terms of regular and substantive interaction, what does that mean? First off, let's start with substantive. What are the Fed guidelines asking us to do? What does substantive interaction with our students mean? And they break it down into a few bullet points. One is providing direct instruction. So kind of like a Zoom meeting, in class. These rules apply to hybrid and in-person and online classes. But then they break it down further to say assessing or providing feedback to a student's coursework is substantive. Providing information or responding to questions about the content of the course or competency is substantive. And the facilitating a group discussion around the content, the course, or the competency are all substantive. And then they put a nice catch-all: other instructional activities approved by the institution or programs accrediting agency. I'm not going to touch that one because that one's pretty vague. So that's kind of interaction they're looking for. But then the question comes up, like, what does regular mean? And they break this down into two parts that we can talk about. The first is that they're, I'll read that a little bit for you because it's a little convoluted: providing the opportunity for interaction with the student on a predictable and scheduled basis, commensurate with the length of time and the amount of content in the course and competency. Couple questions that we'll probably cover there, which is like, well, commensurate with the length of time, what does that mean? And the amount of content, how do we figure that out? But also, what does predictable and scheduled mean in practicality when we're looking at this? And then the second point on this is that they're asking to monitor students' academic engagement and success, making sure that the instructor is there for prompt and proactive engagement, figuring out which students need help, either based on the monitoring or if the students ask for help. So that's what they're looking for in terms of regular. So that monitoring guideline has brought up a lot of questions as well. So super high level overview. I'm not going to dive much deeper than that, but I'll turn it over to the panelists. I forget which order I said we were going to go in first, so I'll pick Alexandra to start with, and I'm going to come off screen share.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexandra Salas. I go by Alex, and I oversee academic innovation at Delaware County Community College. It's a expansive division. It covers faculty professional development, study abroad, educational support services, library services, etc. And so I'm really happy to be here. Michael?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. My name is Michael Patrick. I'm the Vice President of Academic Improvement at South College. That includes everything from overseeing kind of our data analytics for our faculty success, faculty development, our general education, as well as our competency-based education program, where we launched and approved the first SAC-COC. We're the first SAC-COC institution to ever receive approval for a doctoral CBE program. So we're excited about that. That came from my years working at WGU and a few other places, but excited to be here with you guys today. Michelle?
Thank you, and I'm so excited to be part of this amazing panel. I am Michelle Singh. I am the Assistant Commissioner for Digital Learning with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. The Coordinating Board is a responsible body that advocates for education and sets a stage for what is next in higher education for the state of Texas. We represent all of the public universities, private universities, independent colleges, and so forth within the state. And so that is not the only angle that I'll be contributing to this conversation. I also come from a 20-year background in higher education that spans everything from digital learning to also, similar to Michael, running the business analytics side and the innovation ecosystem, as we like to coin it, that contributes to the success of digital learning.
Cool. All right, so maybe if you all could start and just and give give a little more color to the regular and substantive side. You're welcome to either pick the what does regular mean or pick what does substantive mean, whichever side you want to look at. But how does that translate into practicality in the course? And has it made you change anything as the new guidelines come out? And if so or if not, how does that play into your day-to-day life?
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in. So as part of my area, Delaware County has 7 campuses, and I'm responsible for overseeing our digital learning area, which is online learning. And we have had an extensive online program for a couple of decades now. But what has happened since COVID, everything had to move, of course, as you know, online, and we had to provide additional support to faculty who were not accustomed to teaching specifically online. We use Canvas as our learning management system, and most of our faculty have used Canvas to some extent, but when we are talking about regular and substantive interaction, that's a different question. And so our offices here are to provide professional development and support to faculty to encourage them to have that engagement, ongoing engagement and interactivity. And for us, it kind of begins with the syllabus. That's the document that's exchanged between faculty and students. And our goal is to provide support for both the student and faculty so that the information is in the same place, students feel like they can understand how to navigate, and that all the expectations are included therein. From the welcome message to how the faculty member will monitor student assessment, engagement, and the feedback that is going to go both ways between the student and the faculty.
And Alex, I'll jump in, very similar to you, from our kind of CVE program. Certainly we kind of start with the course syllabus, which really kind of is that contract with the students. And one of the things that we've really been intentional about kind of is our course consistency. Like you, we've got 6 institutions, we've got our 6 campuses in our institution, online campus as well. So when you've got that many, different, places that you're kind of coordinating with, collaborating with, consistency for us was key, especially as it relates to accreditation, ensuring that the students have that same type of quality. And so we actually have kind of a course, basically a course build guide that we do, right? And it really kind of outlines what every course should have, whether discussion boards and this as well. And I think the other piece to that, right? So you've got the intentional design of it, but then I think, when we look at it, one of the keywords I saw in it was kind of providing the opportunity for substantive, right? And that was a little bit maybe more of a distinction that as we kind of read, the opportunity word was now faculty, even in an asynchronous format, can actually use their synchronous, you do synchronous sessions in that, and that's going to count, right? So with kind of that change has really kind of clarified it. I thought maybe a little bit made more distinction for us. When COVID hit, because we had course consistency in the way our courses were built, we didn't have, very little change that we have to make, maybe in some of our health science programs. But again, for probably 90% of what we did, we were fairly well prepared for that. But I think it starts for us really just in the whole course design, that intentional design of the assessments. And one of the things that we started looking into, we've got a lot of great subject matter experts, but one of the things sometimes maybe they're not maybe as good at is from the curriculum side is understanding how to build the assessment, what the rubric should look like. And to me, that's the important part of when we're kind of building that and designing for faculty interaction. If the assessment's not maybe appropriately designed, it doesn't really give the faculty a great opportunity to do that. And I would say the same thing, whether it's discussion boards as well, how we phrase those, how we kind of write that out. And again, so we put together some practical steps for our faculty that we hand out. And again, just so every course is kind of built maybe in somewhat of a similar fashion as far as expectations are concerned.
Yeah, the use of rubrics, and for us, we use Quality Matters, the higher education rubric, and that's really a helpful guide. So the courses don't have to be QM reviewed per se, but using that guide as as a template, right, for course design, and it's extremely helpful. particularly for faculty that now have found themselves in this space, and perhaps they were used to the asynchronous world, and so now they have to jump into doing it synchronously. And how do you do that? And how do you pivot back to face to face? And the reality is, you can use a lot of the same resources and the same learning management, the same platform, but how do you manage that interaction with the students? How do you keep it going so that students don't feel that they are neglected, lost, and so that there's that accountability piece that is so important for student retention and success.
And I think one of the things that I would add to the conversation is we're encouraging our institutions to remove the almost intimidation factor of a federal guideline, and going back to the fact that this is just effective practice. It's something that is beneficial to our students. It's something that we should be doing. When we talk about digital accessibility, right away we like to focus on, yes, it is law and it is required, but it's just doing the right thing. It's just a matter of creating this universal design environment where everyone can learn and everyone can thrive. If we start to think about interaction and the benefits to a course for student success, retention, satisfaction, that changes the game. And we need to bring our faculty into that mentality. If we make it so structured to the point where you get lost in that structure, it's really not a benefit either for the culture you're trying to create for your students and so forth. Also, one of the other pieces is this isn't just an academic conversation. It's not just about your faculty. It's about bringing the groups on at the institutions that are responsible for monitoring, contributing. They also need to be aware of what these words mean, whether it be financial aid officers that are part of this conversation, advisors, so that they can inform the students, student success coaches that need to be included in some of this dialogue, IT groups, your business analysts groups, your intelligence groups, making sure that collectively we can be clear on what we as an institution, independent institutions, see and can define these terms as. The clearer the institution as a whole sets these standards, the more efficient and effective it is for the people that are trying to engage it into their specific instructional delivery.
I'm wondering, a lot of what I'm hearing is almost that this isn't about the guidelines. This is about doing online education best practices. I mean, are you actually recommending that people not even talk about it in terms of the guidelines, or do you actually have them address the guidelines straight on as well?
I think the guidelines, to me, it kind of like starts with a why, right? So I don't think it's so rigid as that, but I think it maybe puts the framework around why this is the best practices, right? So anytime something like that comes out, and again, CBE to me adds a little bit another complexity to it, which kind of their update, certainly maybe kind of clarify things from a CBE perspective, but for our faculty, it's really the why behind what we're doing.
Yeah, I also feel that it also validates, the guidelines validate what many faculty have been doing for a very long time, and exceptional online instruction has been doing for a very long time. And this kind of puts it puts a seal of a stamp, a seal of approval on what the best practices are, and it broadens the conversation. So it introduces, coordinators and instructional designers and course advocates and deans and assistant deans and everyone who's part of that community, that network for course delivery and design and involved in curricular development to really be part of the conversation, because there's a lot of freedom in this space to be creative about what this interaction can look like, and it can vary per discipline. So there's a lot of choices, and I also believe that education technology tools provide that creativity and that innovative opportunity that necessarily didn't exist 10, 15 years ago, and it does now. So it's a really good time to talk about this.
Agreed. I definitely think that's the case, and if I can just chime in real quick, I also want to talk about this concept that it's not just online. These practices that we're talking about and these practices are actually useful in all different modalities. I mean, you have web enhanced classes that are still face-to-face, but can still benefit from these tools and incorporating. So as much as, of course, the regulations one more time really deal with this space, this conversation is much larger than that.
Interesting. A question came up in the chat that I think is interesting that I've often we talked a little bit about in the earlier talk. It's what about diversity, inclusivity, independent thinking. When you start to introduce this much structure, like someone commented on, quality matters can be quite rubric heavy. How do you make sure you're doing that sort of inclusive equitable, not necessarily equal contribution and interaction with the students who need it? Like, how do you work that into what you're doing without getting too structured?
Well, I can say to speak to the QM rubric, and I'm advocating the use of any type of rubric that really makes sense. I think it's about mindful instruction and application of interaction. And so accessibility is something that's included in most rubrics, right? The importance of having accessible resources for students, but the accessible resources for students who perhaps need accommodation are also providing an opportunity for students who don't necessarily need accommodations, but maybe they're in transit and they need an audio file as opposed to a video file, or they need a transcript. So it really serves multiple purposes and multiple demographics. So I don't see it necessarily as a rigidity. They are guidelines that provide some instruction so that we all know as practitioners that we're going in the right direction. And there's always going to be something new, but it just lays a foundation for what interaction needs to be for students to benefit from their education.
Michael, a question came up around what CBE is, competency-based education, and do you want to cover briefly, like, how does that differ in terms of how you're applying these guidelines versus how you would do it in a traditional course?
Yeah, absolutely. So competency-based education and the new guidelines that came out, it focuses less on, seat time and maybe more on the learning, right? And, maybe kind of a long-term approach. I think as CBE continues to grow and to gain popularity, I do think we'll see maybe regulations even, maybe lean a little bit further toward that. But for CBE for us, right, and again, how we've built it, that substantive interaction, because a lot of it is, and we do a subscription-based model, so students are able to work through their doctoral program, at their own pace. But and again, the prior institution I was at, WGU, obviously they're certainly, well-respected, well-known for what they do. We do ours maybe a little bit differently in the fact of maybe how our instructor faculty model, connects with the students, right? So we do more of a one-to-one kind of model for us to make sure that we have that in there. And the way we built and designed our assessments is we have informative assessments, and typically we'll have 2 to 3 formative assessments before every summative assessment. There's about 5 to 8 summative assessments per course that we've kind of built out. And that's that direct instructor check-in and the knowledge point. So before a student gets to the summative assessment and maybe they're frustrated and not understanding where to go, we're building that kind of direct interaction, check-in points. Our instructors also have kind of office hours, so to speak, where they are in synchronous time. Students, again, are eligible, able to attend if they want to. Certainly you're not required, in the format. But CBE, again, it's not so much of you've been in class for 8 weeks and you had to do this much. It really is the competency that we look at. So we did a true backwards design when we developed out the CBE program. But the formative assessment, to me, that's kind of the difference. And when I look at the ruling, or the guidelines, so to speak, it really focuses, again, less on seat time, which really, to me, advocates for CBE and the use of CBE as we continue to go. But hopefully maybe that helps a little bit.
I was on mute. Can other people comment on this? Because this is a part that I found a little bit vague. How do you determine how much is enough based on the content that's in the course? Because there's that in the guidelines of like, corresponding to what? Like, does 8 pages of content equal X amount of substantive interaction? I can't pronounce that word. I'm just going to leave it go at this point. Quite thoughts on that?
I'll jump in if nobody else does. Something we use is called a credit hour determination form. So every course that we have at the institution undergoes this, and this is something that we have ready on hand available for our accreditation bodies. So every course is required. Our classes run the quarter system, so we're 4.5, which equates to a 3-semester class, right? 3-hour semester class. So every class we have, whether it's the readings, discussion boards, whatever that interaction is for the student, so we pace that out. So we pretty much know what an average student would take to kind of accomplish that. And then we build in our faculty interaction, substantive interaction as a part of that, going back to, again, just that intentional design of how we build the course out. That to me sets everything, but we document it all through a formal, template that we use.
Alex or Michelle, thoughts on that?
So I think going back to the original question of the freedom within delivering instruction, right, and being able to have that flexibility and so forth. This is why it's such a critical point for institutions to define what they see as their framework and their parameters so that people have some liberty to operate within it. You can get to a point where you have, and I am impressed at my colleagues' description of how how clear it is on what they see as regular, on what they see as substantive. Not everyone has that luxury, and not everyone has had these conversations. And so I think it goes back to what is needed for your particular course. If you have a writing intensive course, that's going to be very different than if you have a lab course or if you have something that is more hands-on and tactile. So a lot of it is also dependent on the discipline and on what your learning outcomes are. And so it all ties together. What do your learning assessments outcomes want to be? What type of assessment should you have to achieve those outcomes? And then you go backwards and design those things. You figure out what type of communication do I need to really make sure that the learner is getting what they need. The other piece is that there's different ways of connecting. There's learner to content, learner to learner, and learner to faculty. And so we can't get lost in only the faculty member being the only point of contact. There's also the way to facilitate that community building as well. And one point that I definitely want to say is let the technology work for you and assist you. So many of our technology systems are there that you can program to really work for you. It's a very different situation having 20 students that you have in your class to having 250 students. And as much as you want to send a one-to-one personal communication to each one of those students, it will be a little difficult for you as a faculty member that has a 4-course load doing this for every 250 students. Let's do the math real quick. That's not going to be anything that is going to be achievable throughout the time that you have. But let the technology system work for you. Train the technology system to understand kind of what you want. If you have adaptive release on there, if you have something that triggers based on an action, attendance, anything like that, make sure to get with your instructional designers within your institutions to find out what are those things that help with workload management, because it can be intimidating if you're trying to go from ground zero all the way up to achieving the compliance standard for these types of regulations.
Yeah, I agree. I think that while there can be somewhat of a calculation based on credit hour, you also don't want to make sure that there's alignment between, learning outcomes and materials assigned, right? And then how much time is a student expected to work on those assignments? So there's a lot of adding up that takes place. But as Michelle was saying, in terms of the technology, many of those things can be front loaded. The course announcements and like little reminders and nudges, and you can have tests that are graded automatically, but then that leaves room for those substantive interactions, right? But these interactions do count as well. It's about having a presence in that classroom with those students and providing opportunities for that connection. So whether it's online virtual office hours or just, office hours or group discussions or, there's just many different types of opportunities. And I think there's this sweet spot, this marriage between the ed tech and what we have, available to us that can really create for just an amazing educational platform and experience for our students.
A couple.
Just one final point, I guess, to me on that. Of kind of the substantive interactions, there's 5 of them. You only got to have 2 within a course, right? So where you're not trying to fit all 5 in at one time, and some faculty I think maybe get concerned, frustrated, or stressed trying to accomplish that. Really, the guidelines are 2, right? So I think that kind of puts it a little bit of perspective. If even when you're designing and building out the course, those are kind of, and you certainly have the freedom there, but it's really just 2 of the 5.
Yeah, and I don't think you don't want to create this anxiety over the guidelines. I mean, it's not about checking off every box. It's about ensuring that through every course module, there is that level of interaction that will support learning. So
there's some questions. There's a bunch of questions coming out in chat I'd like to feed into you guys. So you are getting a lot of positivity in terms of like treating a rubric as a guideline. So you still have the freedom to do what you need to do to teach. A couple people are asking, George is one of them, around, how is everyone handling hybrid high flex courses with regard to showing these interactions are present, but also just broadening that question out to, if we had the keynote around what an average student was and how that's not really something you can even define. What do you have to show as an institution? What do you have to log? Does the instructor, if they're having a face-to-face, do they have to take a note somewhere that they did have a face-to-face, or if it's a hybrid course and the part that is in person, like what kind of reporting aspect is required for people to be able to come back to this and say like, no, I met the guy for coffee, but I can't prove that, or how does that fit into the mindset of this all?
Well, I'll say that our courses are designated, right? So there's no surprise, there's no secret. So students know when they're registering if it's a high flex, if it's a hybrid, if it's an asynchronous online, if it's a synchronous online, we know whatever the case may be. So there's that expectation. And again, that the syllabus is that document which explains everything. It outlines everything to the students. So there's no question about when they're meeting, what time they're meeting, when course deliverables are due, when there's space for, more informal conversations. So all of that. And so you have to attribute that and give credit to the faculty member for thinking about that prior to the start of the semester so that students, have an understanding of how to navigate during the next 7 weeks or 15 weeks.
Interesting. Any other comments on what instructors have to report? Because I hadn't really thought about just the syllabus said when we met. So that's it. That's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and then taking attendance. Sorry, Michael. Yeah.
No. Well, and so we're not an attendance taking institution, right? So we look off participation for students. We're not asking our instructors to submit a log, a weekly checklist of I've contacted 3 students and 4 emails in 12 minutes. We're not looking for that, right? To me, I think you get in there and it really takes away even maybe the joy away from what an instructor does. And I think the quality of that, right? So again, we look in the syllabus, our credit hour gives us an idea of that. Most good faculty members that I know spend well over, anything that they would have ever put down in as far as interacting, discussing, grading assignments, so again, we don't track those things. We just need kind of a basic guidelines as we're looking at it to report. So it's maybe more of a holistic review, maybe than more that kind of that micro level that we look at.
Right. And the other thing is with our learning management systems are super sophisticated, right? So you can just take a holistic view at just the hours, the minutes tracked, not even per course, right? You just look overall and you see the activity during the semester. And it allows you to look at discussion forums that are set up, the different sections in each course so that you see a lot of the activity that's going on. So it's not necessarily about having faculty take attendance. So, it's just, there's too many courses, too many individuals, too much time that you would need to be policing that kind of thing. And that's not the intention. Just looking at our tools and our technology, there's plenty of information there to demonstrate that there is interaction and activity going on in a course.
Do you guys picture that this will actually, so I know there are legal repercussions that we're staying away from here, but does this actually play into the grievance system to where, there is a student who didn't feel like they got regular and substantive interaction and that comes back to play in terms of the logging and reporting as well? Or is it, you don't think it will raise to that level? Or do you want to stay away from that question because it's a legal third rail?
I will say as a non-legal expert, let me put the asterisk there again before speaking to that. I think from the faculty effectiveness side, which again is which is I'm on across the institution, I think that's why we do that, right? So again, no institution ever wants a student to walk away and say, I didn't feel like that my faculty was involved, that I got interaction with them. There's quality controls. Most institutions that I know of has those kind of quality metrics put in place, and then their supervisors, and they're monitoring those things. Obviously, anytime a student has a right to an appeal, a right to legal situations, whatever that might be, and I don't want to dive into that, but again, I think the institution does have an obligation, which is why there's faculty expectations, what we want, and build those things out. I think if there are no parameters at all, I think certainly it probably gives more leeway for a student, in my opinion.
Yeah, I will just support Michael's statement and say that students have always had the right to appeal. So this is nothing new. And the technology, while more sophisticated today than yesterday, but we've had these tools and the ability to see activity for many years now. So it's not, I don't think that having these guidelines are going to, all of a sudden, there will be an uptick in student complaints or student appeals. I think students recognize that they have always had that right, and they will do it from time to time if they feel that there is a need. I believe this is more about validating the best practice than anything else.
So let's pull this back around then to best practices, I think, because I got a little far into the weeds coming from some of the questions. one of the things that someone asked was like, you know, you're talking about all the data that they have available. How much of that do you use to inform the instructor and sway the instructors where they're focusing their attention in the class, and not real time per se, but while the class is in process versus after the fact reporting? Like, do your guidelines from your institutions have instructors using data to see like who are they leaving behind, or who are they not interacting with, or who might need more interaction?
Well, our institution uses Power BI and Zogotech as late, so that information is available, and we have an Office of Institutional Effectiveness, which is diligent in harnessing all of that information. So we have meetings on a regular basis reviewing success outcomes and high enrolled courses, and because I think it's important to stay abreast of that information, and that information is also shared with our faculty. I mean, because retention is everybody's business.
And I agree with that. A couple of the institutions that I was a part of, the digital learning group would send reports on a regular cadence to their faculty members throughout the active semester, so that they could flag any potential, maybe students that hadn't logged in a while, or you saw a change in performance from a student. Maybe they were excelling at the beginning, come to mid-semester, something happened. They were to empower the faculty to take action. The other thing that it did that I don't think we've mentioned, it also triggered the support services that exist at the institution. So if you have case management systems that some institutions use for retention and to help with success, that alerted an advisor, a success coach, that also helped reach out to the student. So that was another point of contact, another point of inclusion into that a student would feel connected to someone. And so I think what we really need to do is focus on the data being a way to inform the faculty on what is working and what is effective and what is not, versus you've done these things to meet compliance. And so it needs to be much more of a positive experience for the faculty as well. What we also did was create some standard interventions across the group. For example, using the case management system, what would happen if a certain action occurred for a student population? You would have an automatic email that went out. Here's tutoring resources for you. Here's all of these other things. But that was done collectively as a faculty group across disciplines because they were all experiencing similar problems and needed to make sure that they were taking action once again to ensure that the student was successful at the end of that specific term. So using the data positively to impact student success.
Yeah, Michelle, I think that's a great point. I think all the data that we have, and again, we've got it through Canvas, I've got it through Strut, we've got it through Power BI, and it's an enormous amount of data. The entire intent behind it, I think you just said it, it's student success, right? That's the reason why we pretty much accumulate all the data. We meet regularly with our faculty. One of the things we have is called an at-risk report, right? So we have certain, depending on the department, has certain grade level and averages. Every Monday, our faculty get a report of those students, right? And they begin an additional level of kind of reactive outreach and proactive outreach, for other students as well. And then combined with that, I think you said it as well, we have student success advisors. They partner with that, and that partnership between kind of the student success coach advisors really is a crucial one for us. And so again, it's a partnership between the faculty and the advisors, but our data is really just about student success, and that's how we use it.
The ability to data warehouse and developing an ecosystem of support, I think, are key. And like for us, for example, using a retention alert system, not only are the faculty empowered to be proactive in the middle of the semester, if they feel that a student needs some additional support, they can raise a flag, but other folks on campus can also raise flags. And there's a transparency to it, so you can provide wraparound support systems to the student. And that's very powerful when we're talking about retention.
A question that came up that I think ties back a little bit to this, we're talking about monitoring the students and reaching out to the students and interacting with the students. And the guideline, it has a new edition where it provides that students can reach out, and that's a trigger. And then someone Zachary here in the chat is like, how do you balance the faculty responsibility to interact with students and student responsibility to seek out interaction, engagement, participation, assistance, et cetera? So is it putting too much onus on, I think I'll read into the question, is it putting too much onus on the instructor to seek out those that need interaction versus setting up a system where the students are not required, but encouraged, or maybe required to interact with each other and with the content and with the instructor? Like, does it draw that distinction of whose job it is? that question too
So-
vague?
So I think this goes back to effective instructional design. And once again, putting different practices in place in a course that are going to be there to achieve what your learning outcomes are and what you want the learner to leave. If the content is created from learner to learner, that's just as powerful as an experience from a learner to a faculty member. The onus doesn't have to be on one or the other. The beauty is, what is the combination and what is the best combination for you? Because the other piece that we have to make sure of is, when you prescribe to someone what they have to do in an instructional capacity, you are actually hindering the success of that particular faculty member if they are not comfortable, if we have not done our due diligence in actually teaching faculty how to navigate within these tools. If you put in too much technology without having proficiency, that's a detriment to the success as well. And so I think a lot of it is the autonomy of the instructor to be able to determine within this framework what is going to work best. But I think it's encouraged to have a combination of student to student interaction, because you also want them to build a community. That's important for success. That's important for retention and for satisfaction. The content itself, you also want to diversify. You want to make sure that it's not just a document with notes that they get throughout the entire semester. Use the technology to enhance that and create different learning experiences. So again, I really think that goes back to core, strong instructional design principles, and being able to create a course that you identify with and that you manage effectively to your capacity level and to your expertise level.
So on that note, for anyone does like student facilitation and encouraging students to lead the discussion is not direct interaction with the instructor, but is often scientifically backed to be better for the student. Like, could that be seen as something that was not checking the box, or does that fall under the other of whatever your accrediting body says is okay in terms of interaction?
I think it's part of the interaction. I mean, if you can consider it open pedagogy, where students are contributing to their own learning and their classmates' learning, and that engagement with the faculty. I mean, I think that the faculty are always part of that system in place within the classroom, but it also leads back to the syllabus and what those initial expectations were outlined to be. And for every discipline and every course and every type of course, whether it's asynchronous or synchronous or high flex, that dynamic and that presence, it's not formulaic. It has to be purposeful to that course.
Interesting. I have two more questions. One of these came up actually out of bounds of this conversation, but there was a lot of stress around this clock hours thing of, do I have to spend X amount of time with a student? And my understanding is that that's not true, but I'm curious, is that correct? That there is no explicit hour requirement or counting requirement of time spent with the student in these guidelines?
Yeah, that's correct. It's just substantive, right? So again, it's kind of general, it's broad, it's vague. As far as with that interpretation, there's no, you have to spend 20 hours in course ABC in order to meet this requirement.
Okay, good. And then something that occurred to me is like, a lot of this is, are you using online best practices? And a lot of places don't have the resources or the institutional funding to be able to accomplish this. Are you seeing this as something that can actually encourage more funding, more hiring of instructional designers, more hiring of folks to help with this, and to be able to get institutions to focus on this more? Have you seen that at your institutions? And or do you think that that's a trend that will arise out of this?
I would hope so. I think we all would hope so. And we also had something, the little thing of a pandemic where the entire world ended up going online. We are hoping, and I would hope that as a community, we look at what happened and we learn from it. And we see that maybe having instructional designers of a ratio of 2 to 500 is not as effective as it needs to be. I can tell you from the side in Texas, on the policy side, we're doing everything we can to make sure that we can allocate, for example, the governor's emergency education relief fund, GEAR funds. We are funneling back into institutions to make sure that we can provide grant opportunities, because we know our institutions are hurting and they don't have the ability to build a 30-person strong, 50-person strong ID team, which a lot of the times is needed to support all of the faculty and students. And so I think it gives us a lot of both quantitative and qualitative data to get together and start to have these conversations with policymakers, with people that are handling budgets, and different philanthropic associations as well that are willing to support the work that institutions do. And so I would hope that we learn from what we experience to make sure we can create a very strong case on what it takes to do more than just remote learning, what it takes to do effective quality digital learning. And for those of us probably watching this and those of us on the panel, we've been doing this for a very long time prior to the pandemic. The pandemic is just going to help us because there's a heightened awareness now of what it takes. So hopefully we can take that momentum and really make some change.
Well, and Michelle, to that, I think the pandemic highlighted what ineffective online education was, right? It did a great job of that. But I would probably maybe say on the counterpoint of, I still think there's a persuasion or convincing that needs to be happened in a lot of private institutions that maybe don't see the value or the benefit or even understand what an ID does, right? And so I think there still is a ways to go in that, but I think the pandemic certainly highlighted the deficits or many deficits that a lot of institutions had, and certainly the students felt it as well. But I don't know if this per se will do it, or maybe more the pandemic, but hopefully that shift will continue for sure.
Yeah, I also believe that the use of instructional technologists and instructional designers has now reached critical mass. I would say prior to the pandemic, it was early adopters, smaller percentages, but definitely during the pandemic, we realized writ large that, the importance and the expertise of individuals who have that kind of background to creating solid, standard courses for online delivery. So, and it doesn't take away from the pedagogy. It doesn't take away from the instructor who will be facilitating those courses. But that type of expertise is so important. Just like when you're designing a course, you need the subject matter expert. So I do believe that this tragedy that happened in 2020 has put us in a place where we have a greater appreciation for the use of instructional design.
Great. We are close to the end of our session. I think that was actually a really good question to wrap up on. You guys give a great summary. So I think the takeaway for everyone listening is this is a tool you can use to ask for more funding for your department to get more help to be able to do these things.